About the time I went into ministry 40 years or so ago, the religious right was focused on a whipping boy, the root of all evil in this nation, and it was humanism, godless humanism, no less. Godless humanism was blamed by the religious right for supposed ills like abortion and divorce, for crime rates, for wayward teenagers, and so on. They got a lot of press for their accusations. It was all very hyped up. Maybe some of you remember that era. Well, I was the new minister of a small UU fellowship in those days, whose members, good people all, and mostly thinking of themselves as humanists, were struggling with the tasks of managing their congregation and paying their part-time minister, and I was astounded at all that hype. Little old us, the root of all evil? What power! I wondered why I didn't notice more of it around me. It made for some fun sermons. After all, most of us don't get called the root of all evil every day. But then other scapegoats for the discomforts of change arose, and the religious right pretty much dropped us. Oh well. We've been focusing this year on the intellectual basis of our faith, which I'd like to picture as a four-legged stool. Our denominational history and thinking is formed by two theological positions, Unitarianism and Universalism, and two philosophies, Humanism and Transcendentalism. Four isms are our legs. We each sit on the stool, grounded and held by these four legs, and it's good to know about them. Of course, in this non-creedal faith, where you're free to believe and explore as your spirit takes you, these four isms do not limit your explorations at all. Indeed, even while we explore the roots of our denomination's four isms, we should be aware that, as somebody said, every ism is a wasm. Many UUs, for instance, are intrigued by Buddhism and engage in Buddhist practices. I myself am very drawn to the wisdom of the Tao Te Ching. These days, many UUs think of themselves as atheists or pagans. All that diversity is fine with us. The seat of our UU stool is broad enough for all of us. But historically and institutionally, we have these four legs. Humanism is at least as old as Socrates, and it is as new as the New Humanism movement that you heard about in the reading. Humanism places the human race, with its potential and its accomplishments, at the center of the matrix of values that make up all of our lives, rather than any sort of God. That usually, but not necessarily, means that humanists don't believe in God. There have been many versions of humanism throughout the ages, such as the Renaissance humanists who thought of themselves as thoroughly Christian, but who constructed an educational curriculum which taught men, and just men, to revere all human knowledge, even that of non-Christians like Socrates and Plato. Beethoven and Brahms brought a version of humanism into classical music, which is why Sharon's treating us to them this morning. I once knew a radical nun who had set up a food program for the homeless and the addicted in her neighborhood. When she was criticized for doing this, saying that she should be focusing on the spiritual life, she responded by saying, "The last thing our Lord said was, 'Feed my sheep.' He didn't say, 'Convert them and send them to me in heaven.' He said to feed them, and that's what I'm doing." This is a strong humanistic expression of an orthodox faith. Other humanists are a little more offbeat. Humanism as a faith statement says that human beings as individuals and as a species, with our glorious faculties and our nearly unlimited possibilities, are what is ultimate in this world. And what is ultimately good is the beauty that we experience the love we feel, the understanding we gain, and so on. Humanists generally feel that it is at best immature and at worst dangerous to project any of these qualities onto a supernatural God, whether personal or impersonal, and they believe that there's enough of meaning right here in our physical and intellectual forms to keep us satisfied. Those who are humanists will find the Greek philosophy of Stoicism and parts of the European philosophy of existentialism congenial to their thinking. Someone once told me that he considered humanism to be the faith of romantic Stoics, and existentialism to be the faith of pessimistic humanists. And if you understood that on the first go, you get an A in philosophy class. Here it is again. Humanism is the faith of romantic Stoics, and existentialism is the faith of pessimistic humanists. The Unitarian Universalist denomination is one of the few places in the Judeo-Christian tradition where humanists can be out of the closet. And many of our congregations, especially our lay-led ones, are predominantly humanist in their orientation. Our denomination, of course, began as a sort of semi-heretical liberal Christianity. In the mid-19th century, spurred by Emerson and other transcendentalists, many Unitarians and Universalist congregations dropped much of the specifically Christian language of their heritage and adopted a kind of general theism, a belief in God, often a non-personal God, which could be known in many ways, not just through the teachings of Jesus. There were some liberal Christian Unitarians who didn't like this development, but when human beings are involved, freedom usually involves change. American humanism began with Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason, and that set thoughtful people to imagining a philosophy of life which focused on human good and this life, without taking a particular stand on other aspects of life, such as God or the afterlife, which they very sensibly pointed out we don't actually know anything about. After the Civil War, humanism spread, especially in the Midwest, spurred on by European intellectual developments such as evolution science and literary and biblical criticism. After World War I, a vigorous humanist movement spread, often led by Unitarian ministers. Unitarian ministers led others at the University of Chicago to form the American Humanist Society in 1927. This organization still exists. At the same time as the humanists formed a group of their own, whole chunks of Unitarian congregations began to think of themselves as humanist congregations. Naturally enough, the Christians and Transcendentalists thought this was taking things a little bit too far, and once again, talk of establishing a creed for the sake of determining who could and could not be a Unitarian came up again for a while, and then thankfully died down. The first humanists thought of themselves as religious humanists, and that's what they called themselves. They acknowledged a spiritual energy in human beings which they revered, and they loved to redefine traditional religious language to their purposes. Those humanists had poets and hymn writers among them, and of those, Kenneth Patton was king. We'll sing a final hymn by Patton, but here he is on the meaning of worship. Let us worship not in bowing down, not with closed eyes and stopped ears. Let us worship with the opening of all the windows of our beings and with the full outstretching of our spirits. Life comes with singing and laughter, with tears and confiding, with a rising wave too great to be held by the mind and heart and body to those who have fallen in love with life. Let us worship and let us learn to love. This was the religion of my childhood, growing up in a Unitarian and then a Unitarian Universalist church. This particular reading was so much a part of my growing up that I could recite most of it, and for many years, when anyone ever would say, "Let us bow our heads and pray," My first and most spiritual impulse was to sit up straight and behold the wonder of the world with my open eyes and ears, preferably out a window. Here are some of the tenets of religious humanism. Humanists believe that religion is too important to be based on unprovable beliefs such as belief in God. Humanists believe that we need to base the meaning of our lives on something that we can be sure of, that is here right with us on earth in this life, and that gives us meaning and purpose. The most obvious value to replace God is, of course, the human being, and the fulfillment of human life, and the development of human potential. The Greek philosopher Protagoras makes this point perfectly. He said, "Man is the measure of all things. Concerning the gods, I am not in a position to experience their existence or otherwise, for the difficulties which prevent this are many, and life is short." That is to say, we cannot know very much about the divine, but we can know very much about the human. That then should be the center of our values and the meaning of our lives. Secondly, humanists believe that human nature is essentially good, and destructiveness and human evil arise from failures to develop. There is nothing so horrifying to a humanist than the traditional Christian ceremony of baptism, which washes away the original sin of an infant. To call a human infant evil is, to a humanist, a desecration of all that is holy in the world. Humanism, when it expresses itself in social movements, works hard for conditions which will help human beings develop the goodness which is latent within them, and to eliminate those which frustrate the human spirit and lead to anger, crime, or starvation of body and mind. Of all the values I received from my humanist upbringing, the most important was an oft-repeated faith in the dignity and worth of every human being, as someone with potential to grow in goodness. This is an extremely challenging article of faith, and it is an article of faith. It's no more provable than the existence of God or the divinity of Jesus or the reality of reincarnation. Indeed, there are days when any newspaper would seem to make belief in the dignity and goodness of humanity seem quite outlandish. Nevertheless, humanists hold strongly to this belief, and the world, I believe, is better for that faith. Thirdly, humanists believe that religion is something you do, rather than something you think or feel. Humanists are not alone in this, of course. This is a way of religion which shows up in one form or another in most traditions. However, humanists have perhaps taken this style to an extreme. Religious humanism is a task rather than a belief. Humanists don't dream or pray about the dignity of persons or the value of this present life. They go do it. They find their sense of meaning in life as a consequence of their service to these ideals rather than as a consequence of simply believing them. It's these two tenets, the dignity and value of every person and the necessity of doing as a necessary part of believing, that humanism finds its ethical system. It is said that humanism has no values except fulfilling oneself, and this is not true at all. Strictly taken, humanism gives us more advice than most of us would like to take about living a good life. Drinking oneself to death is a sin against the potential each of us has within. Telling lies, a sin against the relationships within which we exist. And allowing human beings to starve to death is a kind of deicide, a killing of something of ultimate value. Discrimination against persons because of race or sex offends a human understanding of the essential equality of human beings. Conditions that thwart the freedom and growth of the human spirit are to be vigorously opposed. Blasting the earth into empty space with nuclear weapons is, to a humanist, the destruction of every iota of value in the universe and must be avoided at all costs. Taken seriously, humanism is an extremely challenging way to live, and humanists have often found themselves working on the frontiers of social change with other religious people who believe in the importance of this life. Finally, religious humanism includes reverence for the natural sources of our being. We did not create our own lives. It is appropriate, say humanists, to have an attitude of thankfulness and to cultivate a general sense of gratitude for all we have been given in our lives. This is, of course, another place where humanism and other religious faith systems intersect, for gratitude is a part of all religious life. Responsible criticism of humanism falls into two categories, logical and theological. Logicians point out that humanists reject a belief in God because there can be no such proof of such a being, but they embrace a belief in the worth and dignity of humans as if this can be proven, which it can't. Modern humanists take this criticism to heart, as you will see. Theologians point out also that it's idolatrous to worship or hold up as ultimate something which is destructible or temporary, and humanism almost certainly does fall into that category. Science tells us that humanity is almost certainly doomed in the very long run, when our sun burns out, and our daily newspaper presents several much more immediate possibilities for human degradation or even extinction. This decreases the satisfaction of holding the human as the only meaning of our lives. However, for those who find themselves with this faith in the goodness and dignity of humanity and who do not believe in or are not troubled by the possibility of human extinction, humanism is a satisfying, challenging, and noble system of faith. Humanism was flushed with success in the middle of the last century. They had a lot of adherents. They had worked hard for the worth and dignity and just treatment of all human beings and saw that in the success of the civil rights movement. At some point in all this, humanism morphed into something that they called secular humanism. Secular humanism was seen as a totally rational movement which rejected all things religious. One of its great proponents was Gene Roddenberry, the producer of Star Trek. Someone once said that Roddenberry is one of the saints of humanism, but he saddled the movement with its most difficult to shake stereotype, Spock. Smart, logical, honest, and well-intentioned, but self-righteously clueless about the unquantifiable side of life. Star Trek's Spock, and I love him dearly, epitomizes both the positive and the negative sides of the secular humanist image. Within Unitarian Universalism, the ascendance of secular humanism began to wane in the 1980s. The UU Christians of New England and the Universalist Christians in the South began to speak up, to object to belonging to a denomination that allowed them but never acknowledged them. UU women began to object to the very male-dominated language of the humanist leadership of those days. I still remember the moment when I decided that I would never again sing a hymn with a line like, "Brother love binds man to man," which the men of the day insisted should include me. In that matter, I'm afraid, the humanist leadership was about as bullheaded as Mr. Spock. UU women started studying the goddess. As a new minister watching all this happen, it seemed to me best to take all this theological ferment as a gift and begin to ask how Unitarian Universalism could embrace and practice theological diversity, and so many congregations took that same tack. So for 40 years ago or so, Unitarian Universalism has been a very diverse religious community, gathered around doing things together that help us all grow in our own selected ways. Worship has changed to include more that might appeal to the feeling side of our lives. There's much more talk about spirituality. There might be considered attention to intuition and religious experience by those who want to think about those things. There are still plenty of humanists among us, although the millennial generation and later seem to prefer to call themselves atheists rather than humanists, but they often believe much the same things. Some years ago, the Reverend Bill Murray proposed a new humanism, a humanism defined in ways more appealing to younger generations and cognizant of the criticism humanism garnered as it began to wane among us. Murray calls his theology humanistic religious naturalism. By humanistic, he means centered in the human. By naturalism, he means to indicate that he believes that this natural world that we can see and touch and live in now is the one of most importance to us, whatever else exists. And by religious, he means that this is no mundane, take-it-all-for-granted philosophy of life, but rather one steeped in the religious or spiritual sentiments of awe, wonder, joy, and gratitude. If that philosophy intrigues you, the book is widely available and has a great potential for a book or study group. Humanism has been in our UU bones from the beginning. It was our visible UU body for a while. It is still very much with us as a vital and commonly chosen philosophy of life. It's one of the legs of our four-legged stool that forms the solid surface that grounds the explorations which are the hallmark of Unitarian Universalism.